really a significant thing. I think Merton was very good at portraying his earthiness and his real struggles and his temptations and even his failings. And I don't know that one wants to get scandalized about something like that. I think there's certain situations where one simply where there's an enlightenment needed in the public or enlightenment needed in the church about what is going on. So, I mean, some people are scandalized by things that go on in the church where one sees politics at work and puerile action that one doesn't like and so on. And maybe it shouldn't cause one to stumble. Maybe part of what is needed is a realistic assessment of how institutions work and how the church is a sinful church and so on. I think, too, that we have to realize that I was talking about fidelity and so on. I mean, sometimes commitments, relationships simply can't be maintained. It no longer makes sense. I mean, if Merton, I think the father said that before he left, well, if Merton had made a choice to leave the monastery, then he would have probably contributed in some other way. I mean, I don't think paths ever closed off. So I think we got to be careful about what one would end up being scandalized about. So I point out at lunch that certainly one wouldn't want to be scandalized by the fact that a monk fell in love. So I felt that's a good addition to the conversation we had this morning. I would like to move on to the next section here. Freedom and authority. I want to look at Merton again for some, see his story. Do we need to prime the pump to begin with and say that questions of freedom and authority are very real to many people today, to all of us in one sense or another, if you broaden out authority to mean all tradition and structure and institution, all of the things that tend to constrain us in life. All of us run up against that. We live in an authoritarian church. We live with a long-standing tradition. And people experience conflicts this way. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. People in a given parish want to accomplish something, and the parish council doesn't want it to happen, or the pastor doesn't want it to happen, and you've got a conflict going on. We tend are trying these days to learn to trust our own experience, and at the same time we find ourselves in a larger church. I'm teaching a class now for collegians, practical theology, practical Christian responses to current problems or something like that. We're talking with the collegians, and these are very bright young people, and they're talking, we're on the question of faith, and they're into trusting their own experience and building up their own image of God and figuring it all out for themselves. And one of the questions they themselves raise out of the discussion is, well, how do I know if I'm on the track? How do I know if I come up with this idea is weird or not? That's always a very healthy sign. It means they're moving through a certain stage. In the collegiate years, it's commonly thought that people move from a certain dogmatism about morality, faith, and many other questions through a relativism period, and then come to some sense that a more nuanced judgment is needed about these things. And these young people were representing that. I think it was a junior college who was saying that, he's now feeling a little at sea, but he wants to test out. That puts him in touch with a larger tradition, doesn't it? Now he's got to see whether what he's come to think about God and the judgments he made about morality and so on, out of his own experience and thinking, whether that fits into a larger framework. Is there anything in the tradition that supports his viewpoint? And it seems to be very open to that. So it seems like a progression that we have to go through. So freedom and authority. We in this country, we celebrate freedom. We're into individuality these days. We're into trusting our own experience. And the opposite side of that is we feel constraints. Maybe we're carrying tapes, as they say, from our parents in our heads, or early training in the schools, and so on. So that becomes part of the conflict. Well, Merton knew all of this, and he brings, I think, an interesting slant to it. I want to read you a quote. Let's set the stage. He's in New York and decides to go to the Yosemite, 1941, join the Trappists, and so on. He gets there, and he writes in Seven Story Mountain. Finally he arrives, he says, "So Brother Matthew locked the gate behind me, and I was enclosed in the four walls of my new blank." Oh, that'd be a good guess. Prison, that would be a good guess. That's probably what most of us would say. He says, "My new freedom." Interesting. Here is really paradoxical kind of statement and very revealing of the man. I'm in prison. Even he uses the word, a lot of bondage language in Merton, a lot of slavery and constraint language that he uses. I'm enclosed in, and you expect a word that is constraining, don't you? I'm enclosed in my new freedom. Well, as he goes through the experience in the monastery, he has a whole lot of problems with freedom because he wants to be a writer, and there's all kind of constraints on that because he's got censors that he's got to get his material by. They told you the Vatican silenced him on the peace and war question. He's constantly battling with his superiors to be able to write about a particular thing or to have a particular experience. He's always seeking permission to travel someplace or go somewhere, and it's often denied. He wants to get that hermitage, and it's taken him years and years and years to ever get that. So he knows all kinds of constraints in his life. In the monastery. Now, much of that focuses on this fellow abbot James Fox. Now, his first abbot, I think it was, his name was Dunn, if I'm not mistaken, Abbot Dunn. He called his spiritual father, and mostly because he had encouraged him to write the Seven Story Mountain, and thus launched him on a new life, a new career. But that abbot died, I guess it was, and the new abbot is elected, and it's Abbot James Fox, who is a graduate of Harvard Business School, and who thinks that runs the abbey with a pretty authoritarian kind of hand, who's interested in getting it on a sound financial footing, and is interested in remodeling, and that kind of thing. And he's also interested in keeping Thomas Merton much in line. I just did a series of 4 radio programs on Merton, and no one here will want to listen to. You have enough Merton on this weekend, but my radio programs for the next 4 weeks will be on Merton. And I had Father Roland Calvert on with me, who many of you know, and he's a very insightful fellow. And he sat down and read Michael Mott's book in 2 days, so he could discuss this with me on the radio. But he said that in reading, he got a very different picture of Abbot Fox. In other words, he always thought of him as being the bad guy, and really just a terrible authoritarian figure telling Thomas Merton what to do all the time. But he said in reading the book, he came to a very different understanding, much more nuanced judgment about this relationship. And it was stormy, and it is very complex. But one of the things, Merton really was hard to deal with. He was a difficult man to live with in community, and was asking for a lot of things that weren't in the package when you sort of come into the monastery. You don't go to a monastery to be a writer, nor do you go to travel around the world. So that it really was a problem. One interesting thing is that Abbot Fox chose Thomas Merton as his own confessor, which immediately puts a different light on it. I mean, nobody is just taking an authoritarian stand and is trying to mess up someone else's life is going to put themselves into their hands in the confessional in that most intimate kind of setting and reveal his own problems. I mean, it just wouldn't make any sense. So that begins to put Abbot Fox in a better light. But throughout, the abbot was forced to say no to many things that Thomas Merton wanted to do. And the hermitage being a good example of all that. Now, one of the things that events that Gene talked about before that I think is instructive in all this, and I get a little different slant from Mott's books and from Padovano in this, and that is that Thomas Merton got permission to travel to a conference in Collegeville, Minnesota, St. John's Abbey. And a lot of his friends at that time were worried about his psychic health. He was near mental exhaustion a lot of times. And the abbot, I think, generally was concerned about him. So they got hold of this Dr. Gregory Zilborg, who was a psychiatrist in New York, and got him to come to Collegeville. He might have been coming already, but they arranged a meeting with Merton. I think the abbot had a large hand in this, and it was, I think, to try to get Thomas Merton in line, to have the psychiatrist do something with him this way. Well, there was really two separate meetings they had. The first one seemed to go fairly well, and Merton revealed a lot of inner self to this psychiatrist. And then in the second meeting, and it was in front of somebody else, I think in front of Abbot Fox, yes it was, Zilborg, the psychiatrist, just tore into Merton. He accused him of being a total egocentric fellow, of being a compulsive writer, of being carried away with his own importance. The great line that he told Merton is, he said, you keep talking about wanting a hermitage, you ought to put you really want a hermitage on Times Square with a neon light on top of it. That what he was really doing was seeking fame and fortune, and not fortune, fame and renown in the world. This psychiatrist is apparently somewhat at the bidding of Abbot Fox, and also brought in the picture because a lot of Merton's friends were worried about him, just tore him apart. And Abbot Fox said he never saw a human being disintegrate like that before. But he just fell apart, that he wept and, just almost disintegrated as a person. I think it was, some of his journals after that time are very self-critical. They pick up a lot of the themes of Dr. Zilborg and try to, weave them in. I think he takes it seriously and said, well, maybe this is my problem, or maybe I have to deal with it, and so on. It is sort of a sordid piece in this whole thing. I mean, that you get the impression that the psychiatrist sold out, that he was not really honest with Merton, and that he was doing it at the behest of these other people. And Merton felt he violated his trust and confidence in the first meeting and said all these things in front of his abbot afterwards. It was not a happy scene, I think one that made a big impression on Merton. I believe that Merton, however, in a strange way, needed Abbot Fox and wanted him. He understood that he needed this constraint in life. Again, Padovano says if he hadn't gone into the monastery, he would have destroyed himself. His instincts were so strong, his impulses so vigorous, and he was so wide-ranging in his thinking, wanted to drink in all of life and experience everything, that he could well have destroyed himself. That the authoritarian structure was something he needed, and Merton's great genius, and I believe this is true, his great genius was to know that and to build on it. It's again an example of what we said before, that he took his own failings and limitations and used them as a catalyst for living a useful, productive, saintly, in many ways, life very close to God. So I think he needed the monastery that way, and he needed Abbot Fox. As I read about the involvement with the student nurse, I think he wanted the abbot to find out. I mean, bringing the girl to the monastery and so on, and the phone conversations, knowing that they could be overheard, that there was a good chance of that. and even his reactions then to the abbot. I think he wanted that time when the abbot would tell him no. He needed someone to tell him no to this relationship. Just like he needed throughout his life, people would tell him to rein in things. Interesting example of that is when Abbot Fox resigned, a new abbot came in and who was very mild and not authoritarian at all. And that worried Merton. At that time, he wrote a letter to the Archbishop in Louisville telling the Archbishop that, he was in an interim period now and maybe things weren't going to be too well defined, and he wanted to know from the Archbishop whether it would be all right for him to go out and give certain lectures and so on. We were dealing with this fellow, who prized freedom and who wrote about it and wanted to be able to do all these things. And yet again, we find him, as all the themes I'm bringing up, in conflict. Conflict between wanting to be self-sustaining and be free to write and to do what he wanted and to travel and so on. On the other hand, needing, that's the proper word, needing the authority. Needing the abbot, the monastery, the constraints, the authority figures that would make his life somehow work better. So, the stories around that. We want to draw some lessons from all of that, I think. Anybody want to ask about that or expand on it? A lot of people here have read a lot of Merton. I maybe should be tapping that more. Anybody want to expand on this whole notion here? Or ask questions about that relationship? Yeah, child parent, well, I think so, yeah. He gets back to it, a lot of Martin's early life, I think, influences him, doesn't it? The relationship with his parents early on. Other comments or questions, John?
Wasn't there a great deal of his life that confusion, like from the time of 6 on, he would be with the grandparents and it was a very rigid life. And then he would go with his father, and there was a lot of freedom. And then he'd be going to school. So really, didn't he try to do that for the rest of his life?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, it was a mixed thing, trying to put them together. Although it was no longer sequential. It was at the beginning, but then it became just fused. It was a matter of trying to put those two things together on a day-to-day basis. How much constraint he needed and how much freedom. He often fantasized about going to another monastery. His journals are filled with anger at Abbot Fox, and he's just angry at this terrible authoritarian figure who won't let him do all of these things. And so you get that love-hate relationship the same way he had it with New York City, and all the other things in his life. So I think that was, built into his early training. Yeah.
Was there any resentment shown on the part of his fellow monks or other people?
Yeah, yes. Sure, there's a lot of jealousy, envy in the monastery over that. A lot of feeling that he helped disrupt their lives. But there was also a feeling for it. They used to try to shield him from the public, and then were frustrated when he would find ways to see them anyway. Yeah, it was a mixed thing. In any grouping, you're going to find that kind of thing. Andy Greeley likes to talk a lot about that these days, about clerical envy. And there seems to be a need to pull people down who move forward or who do better or something. Our bishop talked about that on Holy Thursday, I think, at the cathedral, about thinking that in our diocese we were doing pretty well with that kind of thing. We were trying to support one another in our own endeavors. But yeah, I think, sure. What would you think? You go in a monastery, older guy, you were there beforehand, life is very simple, no one knows where Gethsemane is or cares, and suddenly you got this whole thing going on. People, press, publicity. I think it's complicated their lives in some way.
I remember when we visited Gethsemane several years ago. I asked him about how
Is that right?
Right, it's just that, he never, existed. And, there was some ways that he was very, he walked outside. But, unless you were free, it's almost as if, it's such a letdown.
He's achieved in death something he couldn't achieve in life. That self-forgetfulness, we come back to that theme, but maybe we should raise that up again and look at it more closely, because for Merton it really was crucial to the whole business of what freedom was about. I'll read you that quote again. It's on your paper, but I'd like you to just listen. In an age where there is much talk about being yourself, I reserve to myself the right to forget about being myself, since in any case there's very little chance of my being anybody else. Rather, it seems to be that when one is too intent on being himself, he runs the risk of impersonating a shadow. It's an interesting quote to reflect on. Again, it contains much of his thoughts about how we would achieve a real freedom. He felt that the culture imprisons us, that the secular world as a whole, the way it runs, just really constricts our true freedom. That it's moving us, it's enslaving us through consumerism and materialism, and especially through its superficiality. It's imprisoning us at the upper level of our existence and not opening up the depth dimension to us. And that in part of that, of course, that we would pick up today is I think we've got to be ourselves to talk about. I mean, that's in phrases. We have to fulfill ourselves, accomplish ourselves. Clearly, a large part of what's in our blood and bones these days. It's hard to avoid it. I'm not sure any of us completely escape from that kind of thinking. And so Merton, again, is, really countercultural, and with a bit of irony and wit comes in here and says, forget about being oneself. I like that line. Very little danger of my being anybody else anyway. A way to get us to cut through this serious business about becoming all I can be, or sort of letting go of all of that. Merton really was big on emptying ourselves, letting go and creating the space so that God could take over. He loved Meister Eckhart, the 14th century mystic, who talked about us being so empty that when God did something in and through us, we'd hardly notice it. We would be just purely the instrument, maybe some of the ways that Salieri thought that Mozart was, almost purely instrument, where the inspiration for the music would come and just flow through him. It would be an image that would come out of what Merton wants. It would be an instrument in the hands of God, that God could play us as a musical instrument. We'd hardly know we were being used. I've talked recently to a man who does an awful lot of good in his life and touches many people, and he speaks in that way. It's very striking to me. He, when I talked about a lot of the people I knew that he helped and so on, he spoke in that way. He says, I just marvel at that. He says, I can hardly imagine it. It's just purely a gift. I can just feel that the Spirit is flowing through me. And he really, I think, genuinely feels this instrumental side to life. So it seems if we're going to have this freedom here, we're going to have to get into this self-forgetfulness, to let go of much of the way we would ordinarily think of this working. Now, that's again strong emphasized point with Merton. It's not a nuanced, careful kind of statement. When I write about this, I try to talk about the dialectic between self-actualization and self-forgetfulness. As I would try to pull those together, I would say, you can't have one without the other. You forget one or the other, and you're going to be down the drain. You're into self-forgetfulness entirely, well then you don't have anything left to give. You don't develop your own talents and gifts. You feel like a zero. You feel like you're not doing anything in life. Many people have gotten to middle age and said, here I am. I feel like I haven't done anything. So self-forgetfulness just by itself to me doesn't seem any sort of a final answer, although Merton will talk that way in his attempt to get a unified answer to this thing. To me, again, it's the dialectic that self-forgetfulness is in fruitful tension with self-actualization. I want to build up what it says in the culture and say, no, there's a proper way in which we have to study and learn and develop ourselves and use our talents, learn what we're good at, contribute that to the well-being of society, try to make a contribution. When it's time to check out, to be able to say, hey, I did my best. I tried to be of goodwill. I tried to think of the common good. All of those themes that we find in self-actualization. But what I think is important is to get those together so that they're working with one another. So that someone who had it straight, I often tell people who are worried, well, geez, if I use my gift, won't I get proud? And I think the first step is, if we could just get clear, this kind of self-forgetfulness, that I'm totally in the hands of God. I don't breathe without God. I'm not here without God. I don't do anything without God. If we can get that straight, that total, absolute dependence upon the mystery of life, then there's no end to what you could do. Then there's no holding back. There's no time you have to say, well, I might get proud. You handle that at the beginning in one's fundamental attitudes. Then go after it. Do everything that you can do. That's my sense of how you try to put those things together. I don't think Christianity calls one to be self-effacing, to be a milquetoast type, to say I'm no good and everyone else is better than me and I'll keep quiet, be humble and meek. I don't think that's what the gospel's calling for, really. I think there's a strength in the call that we receive from the Lord. So that's one way I would see this fruitful interaction again. And I think that very often it is the self-forgetfulness, and we get our own ego out of the way, that we're freed up to do some things. Merton writes a lot about fear. Fear is one of the great problems in life. Fear that we will be unacceptable, fear that we will make mistakes and so on. And if you get hold of those fears, Merton thinks that will free us up then to develop ourselves. And I think that is absolutely true. So if we could forget our ego, forget our image. He's so big on it. He would have a field day with our current political scene and all. And the way with television, we've even gotten further than when he was around. The image making. Image is everything. It's more important than the reality. I mean, you don't forget that in the commentaries, the political scene and so on. Image just seems to dominate. And Merton says, that's what imprisons us. We get imprisoned in that image and we forget who we are, who we really are. Talking about clergy-laity relationships today, that seems to be one of the things that we're trying to struggle to work out, so that clergy, Catholic priests especially, are not on a pedestal, so that they're able to relate as human beings, so they're not imprisoned in their role. Very often the priests feel that imprisonment in the role does not let them be themselves and not let them, enter into genuine kind of relationships. So, an example in our culture, our church culture at least, where one would have to try to think through this message of Thomas Merton. Image, get to the reality. That's what he wanted and felt was so important. Comments, directions, here, fill in. Anybody want to be at ease with that, or have a hold enough on it? The quotes about love. Let me just go on and and bring out to you what I think is important in this other quote. I'll read it and comment on it under freedom and authority. If the whole world were only capable of grasping this principle, that true happiness consists only in the freedom of disinterested love, the ability to get away from ourselves and our own limited sphere of interests, appetites, and needs, and rejoice in the good that is in others. Now here's a very different notion of freedom. It's an outgoing sense of freedom. Freedom results from relationship. Freedom results from loving the other. To rejoice in the good that is in the others, not because it is also ours. Big on avoiding trying to love the image we have of somebody else. I think something that we often are in danger of doing. That we have an ideal picture of how we would like people to be, and we're really in love or care about deeply about that image and not who they really are. That's a fine line because we all want good things, like for the kids, the next generation, for the ones we're close to, the people who are struggling. We sort of want them to be their better self. But I have the feeling that we need a lot of letting go of that. It seems to help people more if we can just be with them in their current situation. We can just be present to them as they really are now. That seems to be what frees people up to become their better selves, rather than when we love this ideal image and then just sort of harp on it or push at it or demand that people will live up to that kind of expectation. Rejoicing in it, not because but insofar as this. Is it not obvious that when we have this freedom, happiness will not only follow as a matter of course, joy would precise things without clearly seeing what I was doing and thinking myself justified. I'm interested in being more honest and more serious and a better hermit. It'll be a struggle because I have let things get potentially out of hand, like thoughtlessness and carelessness with people, visitors, drinking, and so on. Just to aim at moderation does not really work. Very telling phrase for Merton. I mean, so impulsive, so strong. Just to aim at moderation doesn't work. And that brings me down to the last point I want to say here, and that is to send this back to ourselves in a way. I think one of the things in life that we probably need to learn is where we need the rigid structures for ourselves, where we need the tradition, the institution, the authority in our own lives. Which areas of our life can we go with the flow, trust our instincts, just let it go, and find out it works all right, but the wisdom here to know which areas of our life we can't do that in. No, we have this feeling that we want to work our way through things. I remember a long time I was talking to this gentleman. I was very tempted to be involved in another woman, with another woman, was a little bit, and then had gotten away and was in danger of getting back to it. He wanted to work his way through it in a way. He wanted to do it maturely and be able to talk to her and to work it out and straighten it out, get an agreement and meeting of the minds and so on. But he came to a point where he just said, I can't do that. I can only deal with this situation in this way. The great refusal. No. No, no, no. It just he had to get rigid with himself. He couldn't go to the spa and where she was and think that he was strong enough to withstand it. He just couldn't do it. So he said, no, I hate it. I hate to be rigid. I'd like to think I'm mature. I would think that I could work my way through it, but the truth of the matter is I can't handle this situation. Therefore, I need rigidity. I need the structure. I need to tell my wife about this situation so that will protect me. She will help protect me. I have to say that I can't go to the spa anymore because that will protect me. So I think that what Merton is on to here, which he sees in a graphic way, in a large way, because he had such a strong instinctual life and such an anarchistic bent to himself, that he needed a whole lot of that. Now I think that what we got to figure out in our own lives is how much we need of it and where we need it so that we function effectively. Some people will find, like when they go on vacation or on a business trip or away, that it's just their head's messed up. They're away from their restraints and constrictions, and they just can't function effectively. It just the temptations are too great. It's because one's out of one's setting. One guy could be great. He's fine. He's working every day. He has absolutely no problems. And sees his wife every day. But put him out away, and then all of the problems come. Well, that's up. The only wisdom here is to do something constructive about that. So, what am I saying? That we've got to find our own sense of limitation on this, and honestly, do you like that passage? And Merton says, I've been thoughtless. I've been hurt. It's very honest, but I've got to do it better. With the Lord's help, I'm going to do it better. That's the kind of honesty it would seem to me that we would need. Where do I need to be rigid with myself? For me, it's setting an alarm clock and getting up the first minute the alarm rings. First second, I'm on my knees and say my prayers. If I waited 5 seconds, it might be 5 hours. Oh, that's it. That's the crucial time of the day for me. That's it. I cannot allow myself 5 seconds. I can't say, well, I'll just turn over, reset the alarm or anything. I just can't do that. I know that. Yeah. No, I'm not kidding about that. Yeah. And so it's all on the line for me. At that first second of the day, all on the line. And that's how I talk to myself about it. I know it's all on the line. And the whole day is dependent on that. On that first second, get on my knees and start my prayers. Well, that's idiosyncratic, because other people have their own. But I'm saying that because I think everyone here could probably find some way where we need the authority, need the tradition, need the rigidity, need the discipline, and that's what Merton would call to us. That's what I got to interject in my life. That's where I would need to do it. And I think then finding out the other areas where that might be as well. I think, let's any other questions at this point, comments? Okay, let's let people respond any way they want. Let's do just a couple minutes of one-to-one discussion, and then that'll be it. And then people are free to meditate on it, continue the discussion, walk outside, take a nap. We'll meet again here at 3:45. 3:45, we'll meet again here and talk about the fascinating last days of Merton's life and the trip to the East and the turn.